wanted to thank Ben and Stephen for having me again, and to dedicate the words of Torah that we learned this evening to the memories of Avinoam and Shmuel Aaron, and to Esther Adel, Chas Eliezer Shimshon, who I was never zochet to meet either of them, but first of all, I've heard such beautiful things, heard and read things in print about Avinoam, not just a prodigy, someone who even in the short time that he had accomplished so much, a masmid, yeshiva of Passaic, really died al Kiddush Hashem, right, spreading Torah in Australia. Tragic death, one that is certainly appropriate to be thinking about on a day like today, no question, and who left such a legacy. And the same thing with Esther Adel, who raised a family, was a social worker, committed to the causes of those who others were not committed to. The parts of society that people often run away from, parts that people don't necessarily want to interact with, dedicated her life towards healing them and always making her family the priority. And to both of them, it's, even if I never was zochet to meet them, I think everyone in this room would agree that the apples don't fall far from the tree, certainly. And whether a brother, whether a son, you find few people who exude menschlichkeit like Stephen and like Ben, and that's really why we're all here. And it's really an honor and very humbling to be able to speak in their memory. And I hope that the words of Torah that we learn should really serve as an aliyah to their neshamas. Right. When it comes to Tisha B'Av, we often are thinking in the back of our minds of another very significant day on the calendar, one which often gets paired, perhaps erroneously, with Tisha B'Av, and that is the holiday of Yom Kippur. Right, on one hand, you would think that these days are quite different. Right, the Sefer HaChinuch in Mitzvah Shin Yod Gimel quotes both of these halachas in the same mitzvah, and he says these yamim are rachokim zem me'od, rachokim me'od. These 2 days are very different, he says, but on the surface they certainly seem to have a lot of similarities. Right, the Ran at the beginning of Maseches Rosh Hashanah on Daf Daled B'Dafei Harif quotes the opinion of the Ramban that the reason why Tisha B'Av begins at night, right, Shiva Asar B'Tammuz begins in the morning, Asar B'Teves begins in the morning. Why is it that Tisha B'Av begins at night? So he says it is patterned after the Din D'Oraisa of Yom Kippur, and just as Yom Kippur begins at night, Me'erev ad Erev, so too Tisha B'Av should begin at night. There's an interesting machlokes, it seems, in the Rishonim as to whether or not was Tisha B'Av always beginning at night, going from night to night, or was that a later enactment? That really the default is that non-Yom Kippur fast days always begin in the morning. And then when the Gemara Rosh Hashanah says that Huchbalu Batzaros, we saw that this is a really, really bad day, the Chachamim said, you know what, why don't we up the ante a little bit, let's start the fast even earlier at nighttime. Was that a later innovation, or was that original to the Takana of Tisha B'Av? This could have halachic ramifications. We're going to try not to get too much into halacha, as on Tisha B'Av, as we know, we try to limit the aspects of Torah that we study. But there's a fascinating question that Nazir Shimshon raises, that let's say a person knows that he or she can't fast for 25 hours. Let's say I can do 14 hours, I can handle that. 25 hours is just too much. What should such a person do on Tisha B'Av? So normally we would say, do what you can, right? Start the fast, go for 14 hours, 16 hours, and you're really not feeling well, you break your fast. Fascinating sheet of Nazir Shimshon is not halacha l'maisa, but it just tells you something about the day. He said, no, you should eat at night and fast during the day, because according to some opinions, the night part of Tisha B'Av is a later enactment. The daytime, what we're doing right now, is the ikr, the primary institution of Tisha B'Av, and therefore he said maybe it's better to eat on the part that is a later edition. It's not intrinsic, it's not germane to the fast day itself. We generally disagree. We always say in halacha, even if it was a later edition, you try your best, right? Don't throw in the towel before the match even began, right? You start the fast, you do what you can, and you fast the next day. But this issue of Tisha B'Av beginning at night is a fascinating halachic issue, and the poskim say that this may have its roots in Yom HaKippurim. We know that on Tisha B'Av as well, there are other things that remind us of Yom Kippur. You look around at the shoes, the footwear that we all brought in today that we're all sporting, it reminds us of Yom Kippur, right? There are 5 inuyim, 5 things that on Yom Kippur one is not allowed to do, and we transplant that from the world of Yom Kippur onto Tisha B'Av. We know you're not allowed to eat and not allowed to drink, not allowed to have marital relations, not allowed to anoint, not allowed to wash, and not allowed to wear leather shoes. And that again is transposed from the world of Yom Kippurim onto Tisha B'Av. As mentioned, the Sefer HaChinuch lumps them together explicitly. When he's talking about Yom Kippur, he says, let me talk now about Tisha B'Av as well, because these days have so many similarities on at least a superficial level. And the Rambam himself, in his Perush HaMishnayos to Maseches Tainus, at the very end, connects the 2 days. And he says, just as there's a mitzvah on Yom Kippur to begin fasting early, what he calls mosifin min achol al hakodesh, so too he says by Tisha B'Av. Again, we borrow from the paradigm of Yom Kippur onto Tisha B'Av, and you should begin fasting earlier than the exact second that the sun sets, to parallel with the world of Yom Kippurim. We know that on Tisha B'Av, we read this morning, Arzei Halavanon, right? We read about the Asara Harugei Malchus, and on Yom Kippur again, we will be revisiting that, perhaps from a slightly different perspective. But so on the surface, there clearly are similarities between these days, but on a more profound level, these days could not be more different. As the Sefer HaChinuch writes, the Rechokim Me'od Zemizeh. These days are extremely distant, as he writes. The most basic distinction between them is the level of obligation, right? On Yom Kippur, the obligation is a mitzvah da'oraisa. You don't get a more da'oraisa mitzvah than Yom Kippur. A biblical prohibition that the Torah says on the 10th of Tishrei, one has to fast and perhaps do all these other afflictions. That's a big discussion, whether or not the Torah has a problem with you wearing leather shoes, or if that's something that the rabbis added on. But when it comes to Tisha B'Av, that clearly was a later enactment. As such, there are important halachic differences to be aware of when it comes to the nature of the fast. Hopefully not relevant for any of us right now. We've made it to the last stretch of the marathon, but God forbid if anyone is ever in a situation needing to break one's fast. So when it comes to Yom Kippur, we know that the Gemara is clear that for saving a life, one's allowed to violate almost anything. And if a person's life is in danger, there's any medical reason for violating Yom Kippur, then you absolutely do it. On Tisha B'Av, the poskim write in Siman Taf Kuf Nun Daled that there's more leeway. It's not just about medical urgency, it's also about significant pain. Significant discomfort can be a factor that would be relevant on Tisha B'Av in breaking one's fast, but on Yom Kippur we really would not necessarily consider it. Now, oftentimes significant discomfort is a sign of a medical problem, and so you never want to just jump to conclusions, but at least on a surface level, there's a very different set of guidelines in terms of what would constitute a justification to break your fast on Tisha B'Av versus on Yom Kippur. This year, the Be'er Halacha points out, Taf Kuf Nun Tes, that there's even more of a reason to break one's fast, and that it's a nidcha, right? That today is Yud B'Av, not Tisha B'Av, and then there's even more of a leniency. But that's one sort of superficial distinction halachically that emerges from the fact that one is biblical, one is only rabbinic. Another important distinction the poskim talk about, relevant to what we're doing right now, the poskim have an interesting shaila. What would be the halacha of someone who thinks he can just eke by the fast, he can make it barely, but if he gets out of bed, right, if he comes to minyan, if he comes to daven, then that amount of energy that it's going to take, getting up, traveling, let's say he doesn't have a car, for example, he has to walk in the heat to minyan, that might jeopardize his fast. Would you tell a person in that situation, go to shul, daven with a minyan, even though you very well may break your fast? Or would we say, no, that the fast is more important? So when it comes to Yom Kippur, again, without getting into the nitty-gritty of the halachas, if it's out of the realm of Tisha B'Av, but clear that fasting is the number one priority, right? That's a mitzvah d'oraisa, it's a karais, it's a very, very serious prohibition to fast on Yom Kippur. The fact that on Tisha B'Av it is only a rabbinic prohibition, it's from the Navi, right, the Midivrei Kabbalah, Din D'Rabbanan, that there's more leniency. Some authorities there say that, wait a second, if fasting is a rabbinic mitzvah, davening with a minyan is a rabbinic mitzvah, who's to say that fasting is more important than davening with a minyan? And therefore, no poskim that I'm aware of say that you should eat so you can go to minyan. But they say if you go to minyan and you know that that likely may make you have to eat on Tisha B'Av, that may be tolerable. There may be what to talk about there. Again, not necessarily halacha l'maisa, but on Yom Kippur, no one would even envision such a possibility. On Tisha B'Av, there's what to talk about because the level of the fast is relatively so much lighter. This issue also manifests itself in one more area of the distinction halachically between what we're doing right now on Tisha B'Av and the level of the fast versus on Yom Kippur, and that is in the very, very important halacha l'maisa area of shiurim. Right? When it comes to amounts on Yom Kippur, we know the halacha is that if a person has to eat, we certainly tell them to try to eat as little as possible. Right? Have pachos mikashir, right? Spread it out 9 minutes apart, whatever the shear is, so that you're trying to avoid it. And even if you ate, we don't say you can continue eating as much as you want. We say eat the bare minimum amount. It's not an all or nothing deal when it comes to Yom Kippur, right? Person breaks his fast, he's still fasting, right? It's lahavdil. It reminds me, sometimes I'll talk with a patient, they'll say, Doc, I just quit smoking. I say, congratulations, how long have you been quit? I said, yesterday. And it's technically you're fasting again, meaning you're back in the game. The moment after you ate, you're back in on that. When it comes to Tisha B'Av, it would not necessarily be the case. That with Tisha B'Av, it could be, many poskim assume, the Aruch HaShulchan writes this way, that if you broke your fast today and you had a justification to do that, the fast, it's not just suspended, it's canceled, meaning the fast no longer exists. Again, we wouldn't say that you should eat your favorite delicacies, that you should be mitzaref with the tzibur in terms of the avelus, but it's a very different model than on Yom Kippur, where the fast comes right back. You eat as little as you can. And the shiur, and it could be with Tisha B'Av, there's no concept of eating less than a shiur. You're allowed to eat comfortably, at least what you would need, according to poskim. This may have ramifications in terms of the ability of someone who's not fasting to get an aliyah, for example, at the end of the day. But in any event, there certainly are a number of interesting areas where we see that Tisha B'Av and Yom Kippur converge and diverge. I think by far the elephant in the room, the most clear distinction between Tisha B'Av and Yom Kippur is one word, and that's the word of avelus, the concept of avelus, right? Mourning. Yom Kippur has no concept of mourning at all, right? On the surface, it looks the same, right? We're wearing the same shoes, we're observing, we're not washing, we're doing all the same sorts of things, but it's coming from a completely different direction. Gemara says in Taanis on Daf Lamed, however, that in addition to the Inuyim, anything that an Avel is chayav to observe, on Tisha B'Av, we're all aveling, we're all in this state of mourning, and therefore there are additional things, right? On Yom Kippur, we don't sit on the floor, right? There's no concept. On Yom Kippur, there's no prohibition against studying all areas of Torah, as there is on Tisha B'Av. On Tisha B'Av, it's a day of mourning, it's a day of avelus, and the question that we really have to ask ourselves, if we're going to say that this is a day of avelus, is why? Why is it that we're mourning on Tisha B'Av? Meaning, being sad, I can understand. Right? That we have many models of, right? Asar B'Teves is not a day of mourning, it's a day of sadness. Shiva Asar B'Tammuz is a day of sadness. Right? There's no nihuge avelus. We don't sit on the floor. We don't abstain from learning Torah on other days that are commemorating sad historical events. Avelus, seemingly, that's a totally different halacha, right? That's when someone dies, a person says Shiva, Rachman Islam. Why is that? To show that we're, obviously I can understand on a simple level, you'll say, no, it's just borrowed. It's an expression of being really, really sad about something. So yeah, what do we have in halacha that we could choose that shows we're really sad? All right, let's pick avelus, let's borrow that. We'll be a little bit loose and borrow that concept and apply it to Tisha B'Av. That's one possibility. But I think there may be something deeper going on as well. So why it is that avelus specifically is the mode of expressing our sorrow over Tisha B'Av? And to answer that, perhaps you have to ask a more basic question, and that's why does somebody ever mourn? What's the reason behind mourning? What's the reason behind avelus? And really that question is dovetailed with the sister question of what is death, what is life in Judaism? What is it that we're celebrating? What is it that we're lamenting? What's Judaism have to say about these issues? So to understand what the loss of life is about, one seemingly has to understand what is life about? What is the Jewish definition of life? Right? You can go to an anatomy lab and dissect the cadaver and be an expert in every aspect of a corpse, right? In medical school, you master the eyes, the brain, the liver, the kidneys, the intestine. You can know everything. The one thing that they don't teach you in medical school, when they'll teach you everything you could want to know about a body and about human life, they don't teach you what is life, meaning what's the spark of life, what's the difference between a corpse that has all of its organs completely intact on the table in front of you that you're dissecting, and Baruch Hashem, everyone in this room, what's the difference between a corpse and everyone in this room who's alive? What's the definition of life? What's that spark, that animation that sets apart someone that has all the organs, everything intact? Or you'll tell me it's the brain. The brain could be intact technically, everything could technically be there, and yet there's something that's missing in terms of animating this person from a domain, from an inanimate object, to something that is chai, that is walking, that is experiencing life. And what I believe Judaism's definition of what it means to be alive, what life is to have a spark of God within you. It's the neshama, what we call, right? It's what the Torah tells us in Bereshit. Vayipach be'apav nishmas chaim. God literally blew of himself into Adam. Adam was a block of clay, a corpse, and it's that spark of God, that neshama, that distinguishes everyone in this room from a corpse. And this is really who you are, right? When you say that you love someone, picture someone who you love, a spouse, a parent, a child. What is it that you love? If you think you love their eye, you love their kidney, you love their liver. What is it meaning? No, you say I love their brain. No, it's much deeper than that. You love them, their essence. The essence transcends any of those individual organs that we think about anatomically. It's their chiyus, it's their vitality, it's their life, their spark, their neshama, which is nothing other than an aspect of God himself. The Torah tells us God breathed into us from himself a part of himself, kiviyachol. The chelek elokam ima'al, that's what animates a person, that's what gives them life. So death, if that's our definition of life, death then is nothing other than the departure of the neshama. It's the departure of that spark of God, right? The divine presence that exists within each and every one of us leaves, and that moment is death, right? That's the difference between the corpse and the living person. If you accept that definition of death, that death is not about losing organs, it's not about blood, it's not about oxygen, it's about losing that divine spark, then seemingly the concept of Avelus by Tisha B'Av is not that far off. It's not just, we're really sad, so let's take Avelus and we'll kind of cutely borrow it here. No, it actually makes a lot of sense that Avelus would be very applicable here, because what was the Beis Hamikdash, right? The Beis Hamikdash was a building or a body that housed the divine spark. It housed the Shechina. The Ramban in Parshas Truma says that this was Makom Menuchaso Shel Shechina, that the whole point of a Beis Hamikdash was a place where the Shechina, the divine presence, could rest. Right? The Gemara describes in Rosh Hashanah, Daf Lamed Aleph, at the end of Maseches Rosh Hashanah, the 10 travels that the Shechina made leading up to Tisha B'Av. That it says Tisha B'Av was the vacancy of the Shechina from the Beis Hamikdash. The divine presence, that spark, was in the building as well. And Tisha B'Av marked its exit, its leaving, just like a spark of soul can leave a body. And perhaps most poignantly, I think, is that the Gemara most explicitly, the Gemara Rosh Hashanah Daf Yoches tells us, L'amedcha sheshkula misason shel tzadikim kisreifas beis Hashem Elokeinu. The Gemara says that the death of a tzaddik is treated equivalent to the burning down of the Beis Hamikdash. Again, you could just take that as a simple metaphor, like they're both really bad things. You could say, wait a second, what's the Gemara telling you? It's exactly the same thing. Both of these instances, the death of a person, and certainly a tzaddik, who lived his life in touch with that divine spark within him, but any person, and the burning of the Beis Hamikdash are one and the same thing. They're both instances where the divine aspect that imbues itself within a person, within walls of a building, departs. And the moment that departs, that's the definition of death. In other words, this is really the yahrzeit of the Beis Hamikdash. It's not just a commemoration of a sad thing. It literally is no different on some level, on a deeper spiritual level, to the concept of death. It makes a lot of sense then that Avelus would be present, would be applicable, right? This might explain why the Torah says so cryptically, V'asuli mikdash v'shochanti beso cham, right? Everybody scratches their head. Make for me a mikdash, and I will dwell in them. It should have said, I will dwell in it. You see, the Torah switches paths. It's talking about a building, and then it's talking about a body. It says, I'll dwell in them. I'll build a mikdash, and I'll dwell in the body. It's clearly drawing your attention to this parallel between the Shechina inhabiting the body, the building, whatever that means, and the Shechina inhabiting the body. That gives us that spark of life, that animation. This may explain why Lo Aleinu, in the presence of an Avel, what's the bracha that one says? Hamakom yinachem eschem besoch shar avei Tzion v'Yerushalayim. I always wonder, like, what's the why Tzion v'Yerushalayim? Meaning, focus on one tragedy at a time. I get they're both sad events, but why lump them together? No, because that's the ultimate form of death. That's the national form of death. And this is the individual death. That may be why we connect the two. They're both instances of the departure of the Shechina, departure of the divine presence that leaves someone. And it's also perhaps not coincidental that we talk about Hamachazir Shechinaso L'Tzion, right? That one day God is going to return. Whatever damage was done by the Shechina leaving, we say every day in the Shemona Esrei, God is going to bring it back to Tzion. And later in that time period as well, we're going to have Tchiyas HaMesim, where the Shechina that left the person, the divine presence within the person, the Neshama, is going to be restored to a person, and we'll be blessed to celebrate again with our loved ones, right? With Avinoam, with Esther Adel, and all those who were missing. So I think that the concept of Avelus on Tisha B'Av, sometimes you get so used to it, you just assume that it's showing that we're really sad, and it is. But there may be something deeper as well, that Tisha B'Av is a form of a death, right? It's the exact same thing, the Shechina departing from somewhere, the difference only being whether or not your structure is the structure of a body or the structure of a Beis Hamikdash. And I think this brings an important point up for us to really be cognizant of this time, and that is, on Tisha B'Av, sometimes, this may sound heretical, but I think we get so focused on the building, we get so focused on the destruction of the Beis Hamikdash, that you can miss what Tisha B'Av is really all about. Meaning clearly it's about the loss of the Beis Hamikdash. But why is it that we care so much about this building having been destroyed? Why is it that for centuries later, this is all we can talk about, is how we don't have the Beis Hamikdash? We have shuls, we have lots of great things. Why is it that we're so focused on this? And as our sages point out, Tisha B'Av is not just about the fact that you can't go onto the Temple Mount to offer sacrifices anymore. Right? The Mishnah in Masechah Sota on Daf Memches famously says at the very end of Masechah Sota that the Miyom Shacharav Beis Hamikdash ein Yom asher ein bo klala, right? There's no day without a klala, v'lo yorad hatal livracha, that the dew never fell in a blessed way. V'nitla tam haperos, that the taste of fruit is not as strong, it's not as sharp as it used to be. What does that have to do with the loss of the Beis Hamikdash? Why are fruit in California any less good because something in Jerusalem is no longer extant? Right? The Ramban explains in Parshas Truma that the idea of the Beis Hamikdash was not just this isolated place where you would go and do your services. It was a place where the shefa, the bounty of the divine sustenance would come into the world through that. And the entire world was nurtured by sensing the presence of God that much more acutely. And when the Beis Hamikdash was destroyed, it's not just that something changed in Jerusalem. Something changed everywhere, because you could no longer access that level of divine immanence. You couldn't have that rendezvous, that one-on-one with HaKadosh Baruch Hu in the Mikdash or even out of the Mikdash. That was the starting point where it spread to the rest of the world. So all the good things that we have in life are representative of God's involvement, and that's what the Beis Hamikdash represented. The loss of the Beis Hamikdash signifies all the, what we call Hester Panim, all the times where you don't sense the Shechina of Hashem, you don't sense divine presence, all the sadness, all the tragedy, right? The tragic drowning of someone in Australia, a young boy going to do a Kiddush Hashem, to do Kiruv, to teach Torah, the tragic passing of a young mother with a family who lived for mitzvos. These sorts of things, whenever you come across that, that is what we call Hester Panim. That's where you don't see the hand of God. That's where you see God absence. That Tisha B'Av is a day marking all of that. It's marking the fact that God is not present in our lives like He used to be. And that we have all of these instances that we keep scratching our head of, trying to make sense of how could they fit in, how could there be any sense of justice with things like this. This is the day of a lot of questions, a lot of darkness without HaKadosh Baruch Hu. All Jewish tragedies can be traced back to the Churban. Right? This famous medrash that's often quoted from Eicha Rabasi near the beginning, which says that Rabban Gamliel, he had a widow in his neighborhood, and whenever he would hear her crying, he himself would cry at night, and he would cry over the Churban of the Beis Hamikdash. And again, what's the connection? Is they know that all tragedies, all sadness that we have is the darkness. It's the absence of God in our lives. That's what Tisha B'Av is really all about. You shouldn't get just so focused on one historical event or two historical events, 5 historical events that occurred at some point. It's much more even right nowadays, how we feel just such darkness in our life. On Tisha B'Av, I cry for all the patients that I work with. Right? I think of all the people, if anyone here has ever suffered from mental illness, anyone has a loved one with a mental illness, to see the darkness, just the absence of the hand of Hashem, the level of suffering that people go through, the tremendous Hester Panim. This is a day to think about that, to think of what people go through in this world, and the immense tragedies that we face. Judaism is not a morbid religion. It's not a day that fixates on this every single day. These are not healthy things to constantly be thinking about, but one day a year for a person to reflect on how much pain people in this world are in, and to shed a tear over that idea, and that ultimately the loss of the Beis Hamikdash, the departure of the Shekhinah, the death, as we said, represents on a much deeper level all of these things where we're left wondering, where is God in all these things? Where is God on 4 North at UCLA Hospital when you see so much pain out there? I just would conclude that while this on one hand has a very, very downing idea, right? Tisha B'Av is a tremendously morose, sad day. There's also a tremendous flip side of this that has tremendous opportunity for each and every one of us. And I think this is especially the message that I would, for myself, leave this Tisha B'Av thinking about, and perhaps I could share it with all of you. And that is, if Tisha B'Av is really the departure of the divine presence, it's the absence of the Shekhinah. Like we said, the death of the Beis Hamikdash, no different than a person who dies and the Shekhinah departs from him, then the opportunity, the corollary that comes from that, is that each and every one of us has the opportunity to increase the divine presence in our own life. If we said that God dwells in a Beis Hamikdash and He dwells in a person, and Tisha B'Av is about the destruction of the Beis Hamikdash. We have an opportunity to make ourselves into the Beis Hamikdash, to truly live that idea of V'shochanti b'socham. Obviously, we pray for the day when the true Beis Hamikdash will be there. But even in the meantime, even if it's not tomorrow, you can still make yourself into more and more of a Mikdash Na'at, bringing yourself in touch with the divine presence. What does this look like? How is that? So, on a technical level, there are many halachos that Chazal tell us bring the Shechina, bring the divine presence towards the person. Without getting into too much detail, it's the last couple minutes of Tisha B'Av, so you can't can't talk too much about Torah, other areas of Torah. But the Gemara says in Brachos at the beginning that when a person studies Torah, the Shechina is with him. Right? Even one person studying Torah, forget about 10 people. The Gemara says even one person, he brings the Shechina with him. Right? That's like the opposite of Tisha B'Av. Tisha B'Av is sending off the Shechina, the divine presence. It's all the darkness and black that we see in this world. When you study Torah, you can reverse that. You bring the Shechina closer to you when you study Torah in the proper way. Right? The Gemara says that HaKadosh Baruch Hu, after the Beis HaMikdash was destroyed, you can find him in the Arba Amos Shel Halacha, the Gemara in Brachos and Avches, that doing halacha, studying Torah in the proper manner, can bring God with you. I emphasize the proper manner because it's obviously it's possible to study Torah intellectually. It's possible to study Torah in a way that you don't feel Hashem's presence at all. But a person who does it mindfully with the proper kavanah, it can be the most transformative thing in the world. It can turn a world of dark into a world of light. Tefillah, right? We talk about tefillah. Davening is amida lifnei hashchina. Right now, when you go to daven Mariv, you can think of you're literally in the presence of God. Right? You face the direction of Kodesh HaKodashim. We don't have the physical Beis Hamikdash, but you can bring the divine presence within yourself by being more mindful in your davening. Shabbos, what we're told of Shabbos is a day. It's just talking to Dr. Gift about the Beis Hamikdash in time, right? There's Beis Hamikdash in space, geography, right? Located the coordinates of Har HaBayit, and then in the dimension of time, there's a Beis Hamikdash. There's the sacred palace that you're in, that many have written about. That on Shabbos you come a rendezvous with the Shekhinah every single week. Again, you have to be attentive to it, but it has that possibility to bring tremendous light into your world. That's why we light Shabbos candles. Shabbos is all about light. It's associated, like the menorah, bringing Hashem's light into this world. But finally, I think it's true not just in the mitzvah observance itself and the external activities that we do, but it's true just in how you view the world, right? You live in the world that you create. You live in the world that you see. If you see man as a highly evolved monkey, you will live in a jungle, right? You will live in a dog-eat-dog world. You live where there's nothing meaningful, nothing true, nothing worth sacrificing for. You create, and you will see that in other people if that's how you view the world. And conversely, if you see every person that you meet, including yourself, as an aspect of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, the Chelek Elokam Imal, you're an extension of the Rebbe, he literally lives within you, you will live in a world that's like the Beis Hamikdash. I mean, you'll see Hashem's presence everywhere, right? You'll see when that person asks you for money, this is a Chelek of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. I'm not just giving to him because I feel bad for him, or it could be me someday, I could end up in his shoes. It's much deeper than that. It's that you're saying this is a part of myself, right? This is an extension of me. If I'm an aspect of Hashem, he's an aspect of Hashem. We're all much deeper, or deeply related than might see. And it's all a question of your perspective, how you view things. Do you choose to live in the world of Hester Panim, or do you choose to live in the world where you see everyone that you meet, Jew or non-Jew, as having a spark of God within them? Maybe buried very deeply, but if you look for it, you can find it. And so Yiratzon is, we bid farewell to Tisha B'Av, hopefully the last Tisha B'Av that we'll ever celebrate as a day of mourning, right? As a day of Avelus, as we discussed, that Kara Alai Moed, that this will become a day of tremendous revelry, tremendous joy, but that even starting right now with Mariv, that we daven, we can always increase that awareness of God, of the divine in our lives, and to, so to speak, reverse the exit of the Shekhinah that occurs with these tragic deaths, with the tragedy of Tisha B'Av, and to bring the presence of Hashem in our lives. Halavai will be reunited soon with all of our loved ones, all those who we miss so dearly, and we should have a lot more to celebrate together.
Amen. 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 Go ahead.